This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. During the age of social distancing, we're releasing daily episodes. Today's guest is Areif Sless-Kitain. Areif first came to my attention in 1996 as the drummer for Regulator Watts, a Washington, D.C. band that arose from the ashes of the influential Discord band Hoover. From an early age, Areif exhibited a stunning level of musical maturity, and his creative voice has only become more distinctive in his subsequent work with bands such as The Eternals and Brokeback. In addition to his work as a musician, Areif is also an active music writer. He spoke to me a few months back in Pasadena before the spread of coronavirus. And now my conversation with Areif Sless-Kitain.
I was born and raised in Philly. I grew up in an area called Marion on the main line of Philadelphia. And that's, I think, like, I've heard that drummer, Brian from Lightning Bolt, kind of grew up in the same neighborhood too. The kids that turned me on, like, in high school, the kids that turned me on to, like, punk rock, Discord, Fugazi, and all that stuff, were from what I know, they learned about that stuff from him. So there's, like, this indirect connection. Brian Chippendale. I've never, I guess we're kind of label mates now, actually, with Thrill Jockey, but I still have yet to meet him in person, but yeah, Philly is where I grew up.
What did your family do?
My dad was mostly in advertising when I was growing up. My parents both kind of come from art backgrounds. He parlayed that, like, art direction into an advertising career, and my mom, my mom was a very progressive parent for, like, the era that we grew up in, like Gen X kids growing up in the, like, early 80s. A lot of the parenting techniques that are, like, very more common today were not so much back then. She was she was ahead of the curve on that stuff.
Like what?
And, like, interdisciplinary learning. She found this very unique school called Open Connections that we went to elementary school at, and she was musical, she would play guitar, do sing-alongs for everyone in the class. It would be like, there was not a classroom environment. People were encouraged to be unique and, like, creative and build things, and just kind of everyone was allowed to kind of do their own thing. And then when in elementary school, we found a different place that was kind of on an open farm. And I went to school through grades like 1 through 6, in the same sort of interdisciplinary environment, without any traditional grades or tests or quizzes or, any crap like that. And so, which was fun and very, looking back on it, very privileged.
You enjoyed it?
I did. I have a twin sister. My sister and I liked it. We didn't know any different, I think my sister has young kids now, and she has, like, has to make those decisions herself, and has explored, what kind of school environment she wants for her kids. I think for both her and I, we ended up going to public school in 7th grade, and that was really a big culture shock for us. And so I think she has some reservations around doing the interdisciplinary thing for that reason, because it was like, you're thrown into the deep end, and it was hard to. I remember, like, writing my first name on, like, a test paper, and being, like, scolded in front of the entire class for not writing my last name. I mean, of course, I'm the only Areif in the class, but so to me it made sense. But just, like, there's just a formalism and just that was expected, that, and where was coming from was very relaxed and casual. And
Yeah, I mean, it seems like in many cases, public school is designed to make you comply, or school in general, formal school. It's designed to create a certain level of adherence to the rules. The idea being that that's a requirement when you get into the real world. You have to adhere to the rules.
yeah, I'm completely. And I think there's something, I don't know, I hate to say it, but I think there's something legitimate about that, or that is real, you know, where I was coming from, like, wasn't necessarily real. Or maybe, you know, it could be, if that's the kind of, if I wanted to go, you know, back to the land or whatever and have that kind of life. But being in a city and having to make things work, you do kind of, it is a sink or swim situation often. And so I see both sides of it. There's an idealistic part of me that, you know, and the public schools I went to were really nice, you know, so I was not able to appreciate it for that at the time. And it also exposed me to, like, a music program that was, you know, that really put me on the path that I did not have access to in private school. Like, when I went to private school, the classes were like, the entire class was like 20 people or something like that. And going to public, it was like maybe 300, which is still like on the smaller side. But I remember I had been, by that point, I started playing drums when I was 8 years old. And, well, I started taking lessons when I was 8 years old. I think I had, like, been interested in playing for years before, but the first teacher that would actually start teaching me was at that age. And then, so by the time I got to, like, 6th grade, or 7th grade, rather, and started actually playing and being exposed to other kids that played music, it was just this insular thing for me that I did. I played drums on my own until then for years, and it was just my own thing that I liked to do. And then when I went to public school, my parents were encouraging me to join the school band and do stuff like that. And I think in retrospect, I was scared to do it and was just not ready to share that. But then once I did, like, I loved it. And I had a really great music teacher in middle school named Mr. Murphy, and who was very encouraging. And they, you know, there was one other really good drummer that I was able to learn from. And then when I went to high school, was like exposed. The music teacher wasn't as good, but they had some really amazing drummers. And I've always been able to learn the most simply by just watching other players. And I did continue to take lessons for a while, but that was like, it was really, really formative for me to just watch other people doing it after, like, not having access to that at all. I mean, like, I'd always been into music around the house and stuff, but just, like, seeing it and, like, playing with other people just showed me this whole other side of it. Up until then, I took lessons with this lovely but kind of crabby older Jewish lady named Elaine Watts, who was like I didn't realize it at the time, but was a total badass. She's an interesting lady. People should look her up. She passed a few years ago, but she was a female klezmer drummer, which there aren't too many of, is doing it. But this woman, Elaine, was like the first female percussion graduate from the Curtis Institute of Music in Philly, which is, like, pretty prestigious.
What kind of music was on in your house when you were growing up?
Growing up, it was like a lot of yacht rock when I was very young. I remember, like, a lot of Michael McDonald, Doobie Brothers, Steely Dan, stuff like that. A lot of Beatles. Definitely, we were a Beatles, not a Stones household growing up. I remember the Double Fantasy album.
Don't be
cover.
so binary, man.
The Double Fantasy album cover by John Lennon, I remember, like, very vividly. And I remember my mom, like, explaining to me when John Lennon died. I think that was the first time she had to explain what death was to me. But
what do you remember about that?
I mean, you mean like in terms of around him dying, or like being sad or something?
Your conception of death at the time.
I don't really think I could conceive of it. I mean, and it's not like I was growing up in like the 60s when the Beatles were putting out records or something. You know, I was born in 77. So like, I don't remember when Double Fantasy came out, maybe 80, something like that. But I
think it came out right before he died in 80.
Yeah. I just remember those songs like on all the time. I'm also, I am like hesitant to say this, but Billy Joel was like was played a lot in my household growing up.
Why are you hesitant to say that?
Because he's so easy to dislike, and it's not music that. It was funny. We had stayed at someone's house yesterday. You know, it was right after the tour had ended, and our host was jamming out on some Billy Joel hardcore on the piano, and it was definitely taking me back. I am hesitant to say it just because he's not someone who. A lot of the music that I grew up with holds up to me. Like, I'm a huge Steely Dan fan still, forever.
What's your favorite Steely Dan record?
Asia, easily. Yeah, I like them all though. It was Pitchfork recently did some they reviewed several of the albums, and it was funny to get these different critics' takes on them. I really appreciated. I think it was the one on Katie Lie that I liked the most. The review of that album that made me go back and revisit it. But that's music. I mean, you have a bunch of different drummers on those albums, like Bernard Purdy, Rick Marotta, Steve Gadd. Yeah, Steve Gadd. I mean, on Asia, him and Wayne Shorter, just it's nuts. Yeah, Steve Gadd. That was all. That music made a really big impression on me. But I think it holds up better. But
I have to be in the right mood to listen to Steely Dan.
Yeah, what mood is that?
Well, it's an easier mood for me to get into now, but I think when I started getting into heavier music, I disavowed that kind of stuff for a while.
Yeah.
But the reason why is it wasn't speaking to me at the time. I think now that I'm close to 40, it's much easier to slip into the Steely Dan mode. It is better for older people, I think.
It goes down easy, it's funny. I mean, they're one of those bands that just the older jazz academic people or I mean, there's a certain
because there's virtuosity involved.
Yeah.
And there's a wry a cerebral sense of humor. So people that appreciate music from an intellectual standpoint can get behind Steely Dan. It's it's a rock band that they can justify liking because it's got cleverness. Cleverness is part of the ingredients.
Definitely. I mean, they're clever. They're very cynical, and as the lyrics are really dark if you spend time with them. I'm not someone that is really listening at that top level like that as deeply. If anything, reading some of those Pitchfork reviews, they really parse the lyrics very closely. And, but I find what they do there's something about it. There's a connection that still exists. Whereas with the Billy Joel stuff, makes me cringe.
If you were to make a Steely Dan style record right now, which studio musicians would you call?
Of the Steely Dan roster?
No, of people that if you could call anybody.
Oh man. I mean, definitely Jeff Parker would be in there. I mean, I would say there would probably be many Chicago people on that list, and I think that some of the things it's weird to hear myself drawing these connections between that and the Steely Dan record, but in terms of I still find something about they managed to walk that line, and to me it's still tasteful. I know not everyone feels that way, but I would say it's hard because you're putting me on the spot here, but Definitely Jeff. I would say a bassist like Matt Lux, who I've had like the pleasure of playing with on an album before, and I'm not sure.
But which drummers would you get?
Ooh, I mean, it can't be me.
It could be if you wanted, but you have. I mean, Steely Dan has like sometimes multiple drummers per song, one for a verse, one for a chorus.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, John Herndon. Now I'm just like recreating like an Isotope lineup or something. So it's just like that's not what I'm trying to do.
We can come back to it.
Yeah.
So you were listening to yacht rock as a kid.
I mean, I was hearing like popular music too, stuff on the radio, like new wave, stuff like that, but not really understanding it. Like it was just this strange thing, and some of it would connect, some of it wouldn't. But I didn't have like an older sibling or something showing me what the cool, what was cool. Like,
Was it just you and your sister?
Yeah, it was just us growing up.
And is she a musician too?
She's not, but she grew up. I mean, like we both started on piano very young, and when I was drumming, she began playing flute, and we both were in the school band and stuff like that together. But I definitely, I took it. I was like a little deeper into it. I was deeper into music in general, and like eventually in high school, once I started playing in rock bands and stuff and getting into punk rock, then just took it much further. Where she got more into photography and stuff like that, and like building theater sets. But like what I was gonna say before with that klezmer teacher of mine, Elaine Watts, was we would play a lot of jazz standards together in the basement where I had my drum lessons with her. She had like all this gear down there, like timpani drums and a xylophone, and she would get on the xylophone and just hammer out standards, like Satin Doll and stuff like that. And that was my first exposure. I didn't know that music, but slowly learned it. I would play on like a kit of like those Remo practice pads, and even like when I had to. I remember I had one of those pads at home, but she had a whole kit, and I thought it was really cool. And then eventually she was like, "All right, like you're ready to have your own drum and buy a kit of your own." And I didn't want one. I wanted just like a kit of those pads, just because it was familiar to me. And like real drums were like big and loud and whatever. And then eventually grew to love that very deeply. But yeah, so in the beginning, like, was really just playing that music with her, and then it was only once I got to public school in 7th grade that I started playing in the jazz band and really started to excel, and got into like competitions with other schools and stuff, and would pick up some awards here and there, and it became. I was a shy kid, and it became a way. It was a way for me to just kind of. Stand out, I guess, and not be a total outcast, because this was like I felt like one in like every other way. And
which other ways?
Just like I didn't know any of these kids that I was like thrown into school with, and definitely didn't feel cool. And I mean, in 7th, 8th grade, I think is when kids are the shittiest to each other. Our kids are just mean, and that was tough. I didn't really know what to do, and so, and I wasn't into like sports and stuff like that. I was always like a more art and music driven kid, and very just inward. I think I've like learned to be more expressive and extroverted with age, but. As one has to do, going back to this whole private versus public thing. And then once I began to make more friends, I was exposed to more music from different places, and like people, the music that their older siblings and whatnot were bringing to them would trickle down to me, and once I got into high school, things began to just grow or take place at a much faster clip.
What were your dreams when you were in high school?
By the time I was like 16 or 17, I was like very obsessed with punk rock and like the DC scene, like Fugazi and Discord, all those bands and stuff like that. I went super hard on that stuff, and to me, like the like touring and just performing, playing was that to me. That was the dream to me, and like what ended up happening was I kind of like was living that dream within a few years, and at that point, like I didn't care what scale it was at. You know, I liked the idea of basement shows. Mm-hmm. You know, after doing like a couple years of touring basements, like it got old, but at the time, yeah. So just like anything involving like performing, I knew like that was the only thing that mattered to me. But I had a sense that I didn't want to do it in an academic model.
Well, let's get to the DC thing. So you finished high school, and did you go to college in DC? What brought you to DC?
I had applied to schools in DC, Baltimore, New York, and Chicago. And I only got in, I kind of like, was not great about grades in the last couple of years. They kind of slipped.
Because you were conditioned not to care about grades, man.
I was doing pretty good the first couple of years, but then kind of just like, changed my priorities and limited my choices in some senses. But so I decided to go to school in D.C. At George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and just kind of happened to meet. It was very serendipitous, but met the right people at the right time. A friend of mine named Sandra Son-Odian, she worked at the record store, Repo Records, like in Bryn Mawr, on the main line of Philly. And I would go there shopping for like all my punk rock indie CDs and whatnot. And she, I remember buying some Unwound CDs, and she, was like, we were geeking out about that. And somehow it came up that she knew Juan Carrera. And
for folks that don't know, Juan ran a record label at the time called Slow Dime, and then subsequently went on to become a rock manager for bands like Modest Mouse. And he played in a band called The Warmers. Yeah.
At the time he played in The Warmers, but Slow Dime didn't exist yet. So she introduced me to him. She sent him like my band's like demo, and he was like really receptive to it and very generously came up to Philly to record my high school band. We were called Brass at the time, in my mom's basement for virtually nothing. And then we went down to D.C. to record vocals with him, and we did that at the Pirate House where he lived at the time, which was on
Irving Street in Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think it was kind of known as like the Fugazi House, though I think only like Guy lived there. Maybe Jerry Busher, Charlie Motes lived there, and I was a big fan of the band Hoover, and I asked Juan who he was playing with, Alex Dunham, because I had seen the Crown Hate Ruin play, which was the other band that grew out of Hoover with Fred Erskine and Joe McGredman and Vin Navarra. And Juan was like, he's like playing with Erica from Circus Lupus, but it's not working out, and you should play with him, something like that. And I was like, okay, and I remember standing in front of my mom's house in Marion when we had that conversation. And so I remember calling Juan up when I got down to DC, and he was just like, he connected us. I met Amy Farina at the Black Cat, and she introduced me to Alex, and from there, I think him and Cret, the bassist, Cret Wilson, they were a little bit reluctant to take me under their wing because I was very young. I was 18, but kind of a young 18, and they were in their mid-20s.
And old mid-20s.
Yeah, hard living. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and that wasn't me. But musically, we had a kinship. And so, Juan kind of, I mean, not just for us, but he developed Slow Dime Records, and we became like the flagship band for that label. It was called Slow Dime because I believe everyone's trying to make the quick nickel.
Yeah.
But he's more concerned with the slow dime.
So the band was Regulator Watts.
Yeah.
And when you were on an early tour with that band is when you and I first kind of met. Mm-hmm. I was still in high school in Milwaukee, and you were about 20, and mm-hmm. you played at a loft in a neighborhood called Walker's Point, and I remember the show being excellent. So how did it feel to play in that band? I
have the same memory of that show. That was like a very powerful show, and it's nice that I live in Chicago now, and like so there are, we have, the band has its fans. The last show I played in Milwaukee, I met someone who was a Regulator Watts fan who managed, most people only remember it as Alex's band, but some people connect the dots where they'll ask me after like a Brokeback show or something like, what other bands have you played in? And when they learn that, it's fun. But my point being that by being in Chicago, there are a lot more people from Milwaukee around that were at that show and talk about it. It was rough. I learned a lot really quickly about tour life, but I didn't understand. Alex and I are still friends, and, he lives in Chicago too. I mean, the irony being that we kind of broke up because he moved to Chicago, but now I'm there too. But we had a difficult relationship. He would big brother me a lot. And it's kind of hard to talk about. There was a tension between, like, I was so in love with the music we were making, but he was very difficult for me to be around. And he was, I would say, like, flat out, like, verbally abusive. Not trying to, like, throw him under the bus or something, but it was a very difficult relationship. And one that became like, there was a lot of tension there. And the music itself, held a lot of anger too. And and I think it became this kind of circular thing in that the music became a way for me to work out my own anger that in that situation, and that, I didn't want to step away from this thing because I was so into the music we were making, and it was so, especially coming from a situation where this guy had been, my hero like a couple of years before or something. But then the reality of it was very quick, and it gave me a very twisted impression of what road life was like, or
what it meant to be in a band.
Yeah, I mean, like, I saw the camaraderie of it. Him and Kret, like, were very close, but I mean, like, Alex was a very particular dude. I mean, there'd be like a lot of rockabilly, a lot of Johnny Cash in the van. Like, it wasn't. I wanted to learn like what he had to show me about road life and all those things, and I was curious about his experiences, and I would like ask, tons of questions But it was just like a situation that was often unpleasant. Thankfully, like it didn't impact the shows. I felt like we always really, really brought it, and it didn't impact the collaboration, like the writing, which was like very collaborative, and I definitely felt like my contributions in terms of like suggestions for arrangements or whatever, like were heard and considered and valued. But like, it was a fucked up situation, and when the opportunity, we were climbing this thing, it felt like, we were building awareness and we were getting some opportunities. But yeah, the touring was hard, and he could be self-destructive. And I think how the band ended was, at one point we were going to move the band to Chicago with the hopes of like ramping up the touring, being like, basically a full-time touring band, maybe trying to work with a bigger label like Touch and Go or something like that, with that, that as a goal. But the bass player, Kret, pulled out of it because his partner, who had been living in Chicago, moved back to DC. So he didn't want to go. And after that, the prospect of going with just me and Alex was not something I could do, because Kret was really the one that he was like a very sweet guy. He was, to me, he would just break up the fights, and he just like would show compassion where Alex couldn't. And without him as the buffer, I didn't see a way to continue playing with Alex.
Were you assertive at the time?
No. No. I mean, I was the kid back then, just with everyone. I mean, like I was not prepared to be like living my dream at age 18. I was just I didn't know anything, and and I was just coming at it from a different place, even just generationally, kind of, even though like, it was like a 5-7 year age difference, but between those years of like 18, 25, that's a lot. Mm-hmm. And a lot happens then. One thing about that time, like meeting all those guys who had been, not all guys, like all those folks who had been like, who I had looked up to, and seeing the reality of it, and seeing how difficult it could be, and sometimes like honestly like a bit of a boys club, that was something that I didn't at the time. Like I tended to have more close friendships with women, and which is weird to hear myself say, but I think honestly it was true. And I remember that boys club kind of mentality of it always being, I just couldn't pierce it. I was never like I said, I was never into sports. I was never into that kind of culture. It was always, I was just like in the corner doing my own thing.
Yeah, my impression of that particular tiny sub scene is that those guys kind of romanticized 50s machismo culture, wife beater T-shirts, and like even the photography and the art on, say, the Hoover record. It feels like very 1950s. Although that was Pat Graham, who's one of my friends who took those photos, but that was always kind of the impression I got. They had like slicked back hair, and that was totally kind of the aesthetic, is like tough guy 50s filtered through, like this PC DC punk scene.
Yeah, like you're nailing it for sure. Like that Americana, romanticizing that. I mean, yeah, all those classic cars. And it wasn't just like, it's not just dudes that were doing it. I mean, like Cynthia Connelly shot that whole series, the postcards, and and there were plenty of women in the scene, like Allison from Bratmobile or Kathy from Bikini Kill, who had were in the series too. At least in terms of the cars, in terms of yeah, I mean, Alex still drives cars like that, and he still has this hair. To his credit, that's his style, and I give him props for he has an aesthetic, and he lives by it. But I didn't relate to that. It was that all of that was like very foreign to me.
So that all brings us to the next band that you were in, which is another place where you and I kind of intersected. Mm-hmm. You started playing with Jake Kump and Devin Ocampo. Mm-hmm. How did that happen?
Well, it happened because I had joined Blue Tip prior to that for their last tour. I mean, they've done some reunion tours since, but at the time, like their first run of being a band, it was the end. That was like in 2000, early 2001, pre 9/11. I did like a really long tour in Europe with them behind their last album, Polymer, and we did a little bit of the States too. And that's where they had actually asked me to join the band like right after Regulator Watts broke up, but I was not prepared to do it at the time and wanted to like play guitar and just do some different stuff. But at the time, I actually fell out of playing drums for a few years, and which was kind of weird to imagine because it's so, core to my identity. But I had a girlfriend at the time encourage me to do the Blue Tip tour, and which was one of the best decisions I've made. And playing with them was like a totally different experience. Jason Farrell was great to tour with. Him and this guy Brian Clancy was on guitar at the time. Dave Stern was out of the band by then, but Dave's a great guy too. And Jake is lovable but deeply weird himself.
He's an enigma.
Yeah, very much so. I was older, and it was like a safe situation coming from one that like didn't always feel that way. And so that was really fun. And after that kind of ran its course, Jason wanted to turn the band. Jason had moved to New York and he wanted to do a new band, which became Retasonic. And I was more interested in playing different music. And Devin and I had been friends for a minute, and we had been talking about playing for a while. And so we tried playing with some different bass players. We first started playing with Chad from Farrakhet, and he left. Jake came into the picture, and we started working on this band. I don't even know if the band ever had a name. I mean, it grew to be Devin's band, Medications, and I really liked what we were doing, but the writing was very painstaking, I remember. Mm-hmm. And I love being in a band with Devin, especially. I mean, has Devin ever been on this show?
He will be, but he hasn't yet.
Not yet.
His mom lives close to here, but he doesn't make it out here that often. I'm waiting for the next time he comes to visit.
I mean, Devin is an incredible drummer himself, so it was just fun to play with someone else who could for one, tune the drums better than I could at the time. But he would never step on my toes or anything. Like he liked the way I played, I liked the way he played. We'd be rocking together. I remember just linking up with him for rehearsal one day and him being like, he was just jamming some Regulator Watts tunes in his tape deck or whatever in the car, he was just very positive. And I really like that about him. But he was also very much a perfectionist, and we ran into some roadblocks with the music, and we never got the band off the ground. And I just had some personal stuff going on, just career-wise. Was working at this bookstore at the time and needed to change that, didn't want to be a bookseller for the rest of my life, and went through a gnarly breakup and saw all my friends leaving DC, and it felt like the band had hit a wall before it even began, because I think if we had just been able to play some shows or something, we would have gotten over that hump. But so I just kind of freaked out and left DC. I was just and it was hard. Definitely leaving that band was the hardest part about leaving DC for sure, because we never even got to get it off the ground. And I was it was interesting to see once Medication started doing its thing, it was interesting to see it from afar. But that is where you and I met for sure, because I remember like going by that practice space. It was up the street from the Pirate House in Irving. Mm-hmm. It was 1730 something, and going to get like some part of my kit, and maybe you were there or something.
It was like going to visit your old house, and now your wife has a new husband.
Exactly. It was very much like that. But also because like you were the new kid that was flown in from like.
Yeah, I was living on a farm in Wisconsin, and I got a call from Devin to join this band, and I jumped at the opportunity because I loved Devin's guitar playing. And we had previously done like a split record with my high school band in Farragut, which is how we kind of first got to know each other.
I didn't realize that.
So, but by then I'd already gone to music school and dropped out of music school, and I was just trying to parse through everything on this farm, playing music all day, and I wasn't ready to be in a band, and especially not that band. It was a very similar situation to what you were describing with Regulator Watts earlier is what I was going through at the time.
Yeah.
So I felt like we weren't compatible musically at the time, even though we should have been. But I think it was also the situation where we weren't making much progress that you were describing. I think we played one show, and then it was pretty good, but then...
What were you called?
We were called Sound on Sound.
Oh, right. That makes sense.
We played one show at the Black Cat, and then we went to New York, and I got kicked out, and then the next morning got brought back into the band, and then I was like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Damn.
So I just left.
Left DC?
I left DC one day. I was just like, because that was the reason for going there, and it just didn't feel right, so I left.
Yeah.
But I'm still friends with Devin. We're probably closer friends now than we were then, in a certain way. Like, and whenever we talk, it's a 2-hour conversation.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love whenever he comes through town. I try and hang out with him too. He's the best.
And also, like, when I was a couple years later, he suggested me to play drums for Mary Timony because he had done a record with her at the time.
Right.
And he had to go on tour with Medications, and Mary needed a drummer. So Mary's one of my dearest friends, and so, knowing Devin brought Mary into my life, and also a whole lot of other great people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember hearing that you were playing with Mary, and assumed the connection came through Devin for sure.
There was one night where we were at somebody's house and there was a drum kit. And I went over there with Devin and Fred Erskine, and then we all jammed. You were there too, and we were trading off on drums.
Really?
Yeah.
Wild. Man, I don't remember.
I think it was before you had made the decision to leave town, but you hadn't quite left yet.
That's cool. I wish I remembered that as vividly as you. Yeah.
But then you went back to school at Temple, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I moved back to Philly, went back to school. I've kind of followed my sister's lead. I saw her in this art program there, studio art program, school had always been challenging for me, and had done a couple years, on and off in DC, dropping out to tour, and then just dropping out permanently for other reasons, and never really knew what track I wanted to be on. But yeah, I just found myself back in Philly and followed her example, went to Temple, and really fell back into art in a big way, and began painting a lot. And which I had done a lot as a child, but my art had kind of fallen by the wayside because I was so focused on playing music. And so it felt like coming full circle in a way. And I really I loved going back to school because in my mid-20s, because I was able to relate to the teachers in a completely different way. And I was just able to absorb more and just be in it. And I had some wonderful teachers, wonderful studios at that school. It's funny because like none of my immediate family, my parents and my sister and I, none of us started at Temple, but all of us graduated from Temple. So graduated from the Tyler School of Art, and during that time I was playing in some bands in Philly. I started this one. People outside of Philly don't know who they are because we just didn't do a lot of touring and never found the right label or whatever. But the first band was called South Congress, and that band we would play the Khyber Pass a lot in Philly. We'd get a lot of opportunities. We'd be opening up for the Khyber's a very small room for anyone that remembers it. Maybe it's like 100 people or something.
It's not there anymore?
It's there, but they don't do shows anymore. Although I heard they started doing some upstairs, but the main room that you remember is not a club anymore. But we'd be supporting Battles when they first started, or Broken Social Scene, playing that tiny club, bands like that, and friends bands like Alex and Jason came through town on a tour. It was Jason with Retisonic and Alex with Abilene, the band he started when he moved to Chicago. And at the time, on this tour, Doug McCombs was playing bass for them, and that is how I met Doug, by playing in that band. And the band South Congress eventually grew into a different band that was called Aquila Rose. We'd go up, we did play DC, we played the Black Cat, we'd go up to New York and play wherever we could play there, but it was kind of just I was very informed by a lot of the music coming out of Chicago. I don't know, maybe it was my own personal Steely Dan of Philadelphia, you could say. I think my bandmates would cringe at hearing me say that, but that's okay because they're not here. But eventually I was trying to move to New York, and in terms of drumming and stuff, wasn't sure. I had graduated art school. I was fumbling. I didn't know. What happened was I got a random offer from a friend of a friend to tour manage. That guy Adam from Mice Parade, Adam Pierce. He offered me the opportunity to tour manage, and which I had never done, but began tour managing this Swedish band, and we were called Amandine. We were doing a month-long tour of the United States with the at the time, Chicago band Fruit Bats. I guess they're now an LA band or West Coast band. And after the tour, meeting all those guys, was encouraged to move to Chicago. And once I got to Chicago, connected with some people at the Empty Bottle who offered me a chance to work there, and I jumped at it and got home, and 2 weeks later just very impulsively moved to Chicago. Chicago is a very welcoming community, very inclusive, and I felt in a way I was kind of arriving to the scene a bit, a little late after the heyday of the 90s and whatnot, but was so thrilled to be there regardless, and had a lot of friends from my DC days. The Regulator Watts I had met a lot of people in Chicago through that band, and just found strangely, or maybe not strangely, just was able to make friends easily through it. People just knew who I was and kind of didn't have to start from zero. It was nice. And by working in clubs and stuff, just met all the musicians very quickly, which is already easy to do in Chicago. And actually, fell into a career as like a music critic, working at first for the Chicago Reader and as an editorial assistant, and working my way up to writing blurbs and stuff. And then I moved to Time Out Chicago, where I was hired as an assistant editor and worked my way up to section editor. And during that time, was playing in bands. I was playing in the first band I played in Chicago was called Reds and Blue, with this woman, Ellen Bunch, who was in the band Z's. They were like a polyvinyl band, if you remember them, like Z, 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 Z. Not the one, just ZS.
Oh, okay. No, I'm thinking of someone else. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then started another band with a friend of mine in Wayne, Montana, who's in The Eternals. We started this sister band to The Eternals called I Kong Cult. It's Kong like Kong. And from there was kind of drafted into The Eternals. Joined them at first for a Brazilian tour, and then stayed in the band since then. It was like probably almost 10 years ago. Playing with them, that is Wayne Montana and Damon Locks, who great musicians, great guys. I'd been fans of theirs for years, since they had been playing in the band Trenchmouth in the 90s.
You mentioned that you worked as a music critic for a while. Mm-hmm. What, in your opinion, is the function of music criticism?
Ooh. I mean, to me, the kind of, I was doing, alt weekly and magazine journalism, and the kind of writing that I did was really to bring to readers' attention what was happening in their own backyard, and letting them know what's good, what's worth paying attention to, what might be under the radar that they should know about. And that's what I felt my role was. I mean, like some people, you have to weigh in on the, the Coldplays or the Cardi B's, all the the big pop artists of the day. That's part of it. But to me, being like a local or regional publication, it's more, I feel like, your duty is more to represent what's happening in that area. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of disappearing in a way that sucks. But everything is just becoming a more wider lens. And I mean, it's just different now that you have access to everything. Previously, people only knew what was happening in their own backyard, and regional sounds would develop as a result of that. And it's different now with all the cross-pollination. But to your point about what the purpose of music criticism is, I don't think there's any one thing. But I as a rule, I would never. I would never. I worked with a guy that would just would love to. Would get off on tearing down those artists that other people were excited about, and like Lana Del Rey or whatever, easy targets. And to me, that just never really. I would rather call attention to what's good rather than single things out for being lesser than. I mean, it's all subjective anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that seems like a more positive use
of the space, of very limited real estate. I mean, at least in print. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's not to say, it's if
I just don't like begrudging people joy.
Yeah.
If somebody loves Lana Del Rey or somebody loves anything that I don't particularly like, great. Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, I think having, viewing things through a critical lens is important, but there are certain ways that you can phrase criticism without being mean or just playing into other, other folks who just kind of perpetuate that kind of negativity.
Yeah. Or sensationalism in general.
Yeah. Especially, yeah. I mean, it's so easy to fall into that trap on the internet, but it's not a good look.
So now you're working as a copywriter.
Yeah.
So you're back in the family business.
Yeah. Kind of. It's weird. It's true. I wish it was my own family's business, but It's a different family.
The Walgreens family, right?
Yeah, right now it's working for the Walgreens family. Old man Walgreens, as Wayne Montana likes to say. But yeah, after doing the road thing, being back home, like fell into this. I had a colleague from Time Out Chicago who said there were jobs to be had there, and I had been interested in making that move to copywriting from once I saw the bottom falling out of the journalism profession, because I was already like, even being in house at the magazine, not even being freelance, I was still just like being on a weekly cadence. It's a lot, and especially with the news cycle now being 24/7, it's just like I was trying to wear a lot of different hats doing that. I was trying to be the jazz guy, the hip hop guy, the rock guy. I had some blind spots like country, blues, stuff like that. But previously, like, you'd have specialists writing about all that kind of stuff. And it was really fun for a while, but just exhausting, and decided that I wanted really to focus more of my creative energy on the making music and not necessarily providing that insight for other people. Like I wasn't that geek at home who feels the need to weigh in on every single album and let you know their opinion. Like I said before, I like to call people's attention to cool shit, and that was my favorite part about the job, is exposing people to things that they might not know about otherwise. But it also, I felt like, kind of would blur my relationships in the scene, because like I'm sure that you must understand this feeling, but like when you talk to people, like not knowing if they want to talk to you, as a friend, as a musician, or as a writer who's going to write about their band, and like, and the latter is like, it just, something about it just like didn't.
It's the cost of greatness, man. That's what I always say. Me and old man Walgreen talk about it all the time.
Yeah, right. I mean, like I do still dabble in music criticism, and when I've started to do it again recently, I'm reminded why I like it, because it gets me thinking critically, and gets me, if I'm doing an interview, like I interviewed this jazz bassist recently, this guy Junius Paul, who plays like an art ensemble of Chicago and plays with Micaiah McCraven a lot. But like, I got a lot out of the conversation, just talking to him, and it was fun to bring that to a bigger audience. Although then it's just like a fight with the editor, like what's going to make it through to the final cut. So it's a different thing. I think there's room for both. But doing the copywriting gig for me has been really great, because I have this work-life balance that I didn't have before, and it allows me to do things like tour that I'm not sure would have been harder on that weekly cadence. My job now is very flexible. I mean, like there's still limitations, but to be able to work remotely and get a couple weeks off here or there to do dates is really a lot for me. But bigger than that even is just like leaving work at a reasonable hour and being able to open my head up to other things, making music or whatever, and not like, yeah, that to me at this age is, being in my early 40s is a big deal.
What do you dream about now?
So, I mean, my dreams remain wanting to keep making things, creating things, finding other musicians who, bring out the best in me. I still dream about doing more of my own music, which honestly, like in my high school band, I was writing, a third of it myself and like singing it too, and like kind of stepped away from that and have never completely returned. And I get a lot of encouragement from the people in the Chicago scene, and whoever I meet in my life. I surround myself with like good energy, positive people, and yeah, I think that sometimes I'm my own biggest obstacle. But like, I want to keep I want to do more musically. I also, a dream of mine is to return to the art making, and like, yeah, my partner Lydia now, you know, is deeply in the art world in Chicago, and I'm exposed to that in a very different way than I had been when I first arrived there. And it's been very eye-opening. And seeing like the similarities and differences between the music scene, art scene. So I've been thinking about, I think about that more. So I would say like, I can't give like a pithy, or not pithy, I can't give like a concise answer to this. But something in having, you know, flexing those creative muscles and, you know, being in it, in music, in art, and is very important to me. That's a dream to me. But also like network, family, in a general sense of like, you know, the people in my community, like building that out and have something that feels like home to me. Like those are dreams of mine. And like, in addition to having like having it be like comfortable enough that I have the mental space to dream, to continue dreaming and doing those things where it's not all taken up with like what needs to be done day to day, you know, all
right,
that
survival.
Like, yeah, exactly.
Well, I feel like we've been kind of peripheral members of each other's communities for a long time, and it's been great getting to know you a little bit better.
Absolutely.
Areif, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.